Okay, perfect. I'll start again then. Hi, everybody. Hi, everybody. Sorry about that. We had a little bit of technical difficulties, so we're starting a bit later. My name is Jay. I'm with the Communist Party. I'm here in Toronto. We have two. Perfect. I'll start again then. Hi, everybody. So we have two presenters tonight. The first will be Naomi Rankin, who is the leader of the Communist Party Alberta. And the second will be Liz Rowley, who is the leader of the Communist Party of Canada. She's also in Toronto. So they will both make two presentations, during which you can put any questions you have for the presenters in the chat box in YouTube, or alternately, you can also email them to me at watts@cpc-pcc.ca. That's WATTS. But the quickest way is probably just to put them in the chat box. So without further ado, and sorry for the late start, we will get going with Naomi as our presenter. Thank you very much.
Okay, hello everybody. Hello friends and comrades. Thank you for joining us tonight. I hope this second attempt runs a little more smoothly. So I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about the general structure of the Alberta economy. Now, we could run a whole course on this, like a university semester. I'm going to try to fit it down into about 10 minutes. So it's going to be just in very general terms, but basically just how we see the salient features of the Alberta economy. So I thought I'm going to start my slideshow here. And here we go. Okay, so I found a cartoon on Facebook, which I think exemplifies the conservative attitude to how to handle the situation of a pandemic. The speech box says, because of this highly contagious and deadly virus, we have to remove environmental regulations on the energy industry. But haircuts are fine. So this, in fact, actually exemplifies, this is almost not a joke. This is almost literally what they have done. They did not close down, labor camps, the work camps out, which are places where people are crammed together and the source of contagion. They didn't close down or require any special safety regulations in meatpacking plants until after hundreds were infected and several had died. So it's very much an ideological driven response to the virus rather than a practical or a scientific one. But I'm not going to go into great detail about all the things they've done wrong. I just want to give something of a background about what is the nature of the Alberta economy and the relationship of conservative governments to it. And then I'll hand over to Liz, who will talk to you about what our program is, what our response would be. So since the discovery of oil in Alberta, really, Alberta has been sort of like a company town. It was primarily an agricultural province before that point. We did not already have a diverse industry, and the oil and gas, the energy sector has loomed so large in the economy. It hasn't been the complete picture in terms of actual employment or wealth production, but it has been large enough that it has essentially captured the whole political arena, that each successive conservative government and the NDP government that we had recently as well have all been totally wedded to the oil and gas, the energy sector as the engine of the economy, as the be-all and end-all of the Alberta economy. So from the very beginning, they were given low royalty rates. They negotiated low rates of royalties on the resource that we, in fact, own, in order to, they said, to attract investment in the first place. This was initially declared to be a temporary measure. Peter Lougheed is the sort of the great hero that not just the Conservatives, but even the NDP try to claim that they have, inherited the mantle of Peter Lougheed. He said that this was intended as a temporary measure. even Peter Lougheed actually came out and spoke publicly about being appalled at how the continuation of low royalty rates, but they've continued low and never been increased when they were supposed to be, at the point of having recouped initial expenses, higher rates were supposed to kick in. So besides that, of course, corporate income taxes have never been extremely high, and they've been reduced over and over. This is just the basic neoliberal pattern of decreased taxes and cutting services whenever there's any kind of an economic challenge. So now there has been environmental regulations instituted over the last 50 years or so, but the enforcement of them has been very lax. This is part of the same pattern of everything for this particular corporate sector. And of course, right now, the most egregious example, they've actually announced that using the pandemic as a pretext, they're simply suspending the requirement for all kinds of environmental monitoring for the whole energy sector. So in addition to the taxes and the royalties and rents being very low, below market value, the tracking and the collection of them has been sloppy and incomplete. We know that there's been millions of dollars a year of unpaid rents to the farmers who were supposed to be compensated for oil wells being planted on their land, and to the tune of millions each year. They've just simply not been paid, and the government has stepped in to pay the farmers and has then failed to collect from the companies. We know that they've been delinquent in paying municipal taxes. And we know that the tracking of actual production and sale of the product has been sloppy. It's quite certain that there's been royalties that have gone unpaid because there hasn't been consistent, complete reporting of what should have been paid. So, and of course, taxes have been kept low. So this is part of the general overall policy of neoliberalism, of austerity and corporate tax breaks rather than support for human services or people's needs. We'll be talking about a policy in complete contrast with this a little bit later on when Liz has the floor. So although some lip service has been paid to the idea of diversifying the economy, the conservative governments have been weak, sloppy, and inept in their attempts to do so. They've made bad choices in terms of what to do. Their idea of diversifying has not really been diversity. It's been pouring money into things that are as close as possible just to the original resource extraction in the energy sector. And they have not ever required either job creation or environmental stewardship as a condition of pouring money into ill-advised projects, because they're just not ideologically committed to playing the role that a government needs to play in managing an economy. They're really ideologically wedded to the idea that government shouldn't do that. So here's an overall picture. Government share of taxes and royalties as a percentage of oil and gas profits. And the different countries, now this is not all the countries in the world where there is oil and gas, but just a few of the more advanced and the more prosperous ones that you would think could be in a better position to make a better deal for the government share of revenues. So in Saudi Arabia, the government share of taxes and royalties is 85%. In Norway, where they have a heritage, the equivalent of the heritage saving is in the trillions as opposed to a paltry few million that we have in Alberta. Their rate of the government share is approximately 77%. In China, it's about 64%. Australia, which also suffers from a neoliberal kind of government, so they haven't given themselves as good a deal, it's about 57%. In Canada, it's about 33%. So it's less than half the rate that Saudi Arabia and Norway get. A few years ago, there was a law passed in Canada requiring that the oil and gas companies to publish what their rates of tax paying were in various countries around the world. The idea of this was that it was going to show that, that Canada received a bigger share and that other countries were at a disadvantage. In fact, it showed that Canada is missing out on billions in income tax and royalty revenue from those corporations because it's given a better deal to these corporations than places like Ivory Coast. So now, a point that we think is really impossible really important in economic strategy is that putting everything into the oil and gas sector is really a dead-end strategy. Fossil fuels are just obsolete. I mean, capitalism as a system retards research and development. After a certain point, and we've reached that point, it's no longer an engine of economic or of technological and scientific development, but it becomes a brake on the development. But even so, even with the disproportionate power and influence of the energy sector, of the oil and gas companies around the world is moving on to things like electric cars and renewable energy sources and so on. And fossil fuels are simply obsolete. Even if there were no problem of climate change, which of course there is, there would be a trend towards better technology. The new technologies are cleaner and healthier. And the countries that are oil and gas importers have every reason, have every motivation to go on to the newer technologies so they don't have to spend valuable money on importing oil and gas. So even if there were no ecological or climate reason, they would be moving on. So oil and gas is not going to continue to be in demand in the way that it has been in the past. The tar sands are probably the dirtiest, most expensive source in the world. It's never really a good idea. And it's quite clear, from recent events just before the pandemic began, that Russia and Saudi Arabia got into a conflict and lowered the price of oil and gas to the point that way below the point, the dollar value where the tar sands could recoup their expenses, let alone make a profit. And this can go on into the indefinite future. One of the things that showed us is that we already knew from experience that the price of oil and gas is very volatile. But it makes perfectly clear that Alberta and Canada as a whole has no ability to influence this, that our share of the world's supply is really quite small. We are bit players in terms of manipulating supply or demand. We have no influence on the price. The price is going to be set by others. And furthermore, the oil and gas sector is not immune to the ongoing march of automation and new technologies where the same amount of work and production can take place with fewer workers required. So there's actually declining employment rates within the oil and gas sector, whether or not the price of oil or gas was high or low. The companies are in a position to get more production with fewer workers, and they're going to take that opportunity. They're going to do that. It's been pretty clear for some time that we have that employment within the sector isn't really that high. The number of jobs that are available in ongoing production is not high. The really big bump in employment comes in big construction projects, but that would imply that you'd have to continually go on building enormous new projects and enormously increasing your productive capacity in a world where it's decreasingly likely that we can sell our product. So in the course of the last 10 years, there's a graph that shows that there's a red line that's going up pretty consistently through that whole time. that's the millions of barrels per day that are being produced. There's the blue line, which is for the number of jobs, is much more volatile. It went up and then it went down, and as production continued to increase, the number of jobs has remained almost stable. So although there was an increase in the middle of that decade, there's then a sharp decline in 2015, 2016. As you may remember, there was a fall in the price of oil and gas then that really had an impact on drilling in Alberta. And since then, essentially, the employment has remained stable as production continually increases. And we should expect this to be the trend into the foreseeable future. There will, no matter how much we increase production, it's not in fact going to increase the number of jobs, because automation will keep pace with increased production. So how did they get away with this? Well, Alberta has a reputation for being extremely conservative, extremely backward. And although this is an oversimplification, there are some factors which have weakened the response of the working class to this kind of government policy. The fact is that Alberta was predominantly agricultural when the oil and gas sector began. And a lot of the initial generation of workers in the oil patch were, in fact, farmers. They were drawn from the farming population. And they brought some petty bourgeois attitudes into the working class, right into the 60s and 70s. There were really a lot of the workers in Alberta were 1 or 2 generations off the farm and still aspired to go back to the farm. They thought of their industrial jobs as a temporary measure until agriculture improved and they could go back to being farmers. It's also the case that there were real moves made by the corporations to reduce and break the unions in the energy sector, and so that the level of unionization there has gone down since the peak in the 80s, at the beginning of the 80s, and there was in fact significant split in the labor movement when the building trades broke off from the Canadian Labour Congress and the Alberta Federation of Labour. So, and those construction unions, of course, are relatively more significant in the oil and gas sector. They have a very much of a craft unionism kind of attitude of simply supporting the short-term benefits of their own members without having any kind of long-term view of the needs of the class as a whole. So we have a lot of trouble. There's a lot of weaknesses within the working class, but that's not the only thing that's going on. There are other aspects of the working class in Alberta as well. But one thing, there is increased urbanization. Since that era when most of the workers were off the farm, there's been a great deal of immigration, both from other provinces and from other countries. The working class has become much more diversified and much more sophisticated. There's increased urbanization. And there's also a diversity of employment just because of the decline of job possibilities in the energy sector. So even though the energy sector maintains its stranglehold on the political process in Alberta, in fact, there's a reservoir of people in other sectors. And so really, the most important thing is how can we work together with other people? How can we help to unite the working class and bring a policy of resistance and a policy of class struggle into the union movement and into the working class as a whole? So I will stop there and can hand it over to Liz to tell you, in fact, what our answer is to that question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Naomi. That was very interesting, and I will try and see what I can do to follow up with your introduction. So I guess there are a couple of things that I think might be important to note here. One of them is, of course, that the oil and gas industry is an industry of the past, and that Canada is a very energy-rich country. And unlike some other countries around the world, we are not dependent on oil and gas in order to heat our homes or fire up our factories and so forth. We have a lot of different energy opportunities or energy sources in Canada, including hydroelectric, for example. We also have atomic energy, etc. Not all of these we want to use, like oil and gas, particularly the oil industry. But we have choices. And of course, the choices that most people feel are pretty important to make these days are in the renewable sector. And we have, so we are looking at thermal energy, for example, solar, wind, hydroelectric, and I'm sure there will be more new developments in renewable energy sectors as we make big, significant investments, public investments in this sector, and it expands. It is the case that renewable energies are not at this point sufficient to be able to provide all of the energy that's needed in Canada to heat our homes and to fire up our factories and so on. But this is the way of the future, and this is the way that we want to invest. We think it's important to invest. So we want to see a phase out of the development of the oil industry in the first place. We want to see the phased out closure of the Alberta tar sands, because not only are they not useful, but they do a great deal of damage in terms of the environment, as I think probably most of the people who are listening today are aware. So I won't say much about that other than the environmental requirements for Canada and for countries around the world are to phase out the use of these kinds of energy sources as soon as possible. So we want to stop carbon emissions, for example, by 50% by 2030 and have net zero emissions by 2050. This is very important in terms of the future of the planet, the future of our country. And as I said earlier, we are very lucky that in Canada we have choices and we have options, and we are, I think, morally as well as economically obliged to make those kinds of choices. So the other issue, I think, is the pandemic and the crisis, the economic crisis, the recession, which is looking a whole lot more like a deep depression. Some of the economists who are being quoted these days are pointing out that we are facing into the worst depression since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And this has underlined all sorts of the fault lines that Canada and Canadian residents are facing as a result of the development of capitalism over the last 100 years in this country and before that. But industrial capitalism certainly, and the fact that profit has been virtually the only motive for developing Canada. So we see now that a healthcare system which started off as a socialized medicine with the intent of expanding it so that it would cover things like long-term care, dental care, vision care, and so forth, has actually been increasingly and silently and secretly privatized. And so we find out that we're in the middle of this pandemic, that in fact we don't have the hospital services that we need. We don't have the staffing that we need. We don't have the doctors that we need. We don't have sufficient care for the elderly and the infirm in long-term care. And we don't have the ability to manufacture the healthcare equipment that we need, whether it's masks or ventilators or all of the things that are needed in this pandemic, and that we are really dependent on a supply chain that goes across the continent and off the continent to get things that are really essential. So probably many people here tonight have heard about the scandal of the Canadian government trying to secure medical equipment and having purchased it and then find it stolen off the tarmacs before it can be can be secured by the medical establishment in Canada. So some other company has already grabbed it up or taken it off. So so all of these things are showing, what is wrong and what needs to be different. I think the other thing is that we are going to see more and more is the loss of jobs and incomes that are the result of this. I won't say the result of the pandemic, because it's capitalism that's caused the crisis that we're currently facing into. But certainly the pandemic has triggered this recession and depression and that we're headed into, and it's the trigger. So it's sort of underlined some of the bigger problems. So we know that there are about 7 million people who are either out of work or who are on reduced hours and who can't get by without getting their jobs back. And we know that a lot of the corporations that had hired them, that had employed them before the pandemic, are not planning to bring back everybody that used to work for them. The federal government has made some efforts to try and tie the workers to their employers, but of course employers are not about to be told who they can hire or who they have to take back because the government tells them to do that. And we know that some factories are never going to reopen. We can read every day in the newspaper, there's some new corporation that has closed its doors or announced that it's leaving, or announced that it is going to be reopening, but with quite a different work model. Some of these companies will say, well, it's because of the pandemic and social distancing and so forth. And some of them will just say, well, they're going to be doing more with fewer workers. It's a way for them to do restructuring that gets around the collective agreements that many of them have signed on to if they have unionized workplaces, or to just damn the torpedoes and do what they want, and who's going to stop them. And as a result, we can expect that an awful lot of the people who are currently unemployed or underemployed as a result of the recession we're headed into are not going to be going back to work. So how are they going to live? How are they going to pay the rent? And how are they going to feed their families? How are they going to educate their kids? How are they going to, what kind of future is there for them? Well, if you are an advocate of the capitalist system, you'll just say, well, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, or just learn to live with it. But of course, capitalism offers solutions only for employers and for profit makers. It's socialism that is has the answers and the way forward for working people. And so the way we see things is that this is an opportunity to make big changes in the economy. We think that the main problem that Canadians are facing now is capitalism, and that the real solution is socialism. And socialism, by the way, means, where working people are in charge, they make the decisions about the future of the country. And don't have to deal with multinational corporations or transnational corporations that are are here simply and only to make money and make more money and more money. So socialism is a social system whereby the direction that the country takes, the kinds of decisions that it makes, are made not in the interests of corporations and profits, but in the interests of working people who make those profits and produce that wealth for the country as a whole. So we think one of the first things that we need to do is look at policies that will put the country back to work, that everybody has a right to a job and a good job with good pay. So this opens up the possibilities, for example, now of a shorter work week with no loss in take-home pay. We know a lot of people now are underemployed. And when you say shorter work week, they'll say, well, wait a minute, I need a full-time job with a full-time wage. But we think the way forward here is not to increase hours, but to decrease hours, but not decrease paychecks, so that 32 hours of work for 40 hours take-home pay would enable a lot of people who are now in jobs that are increasingly automated, or their workplaces are going to be automated and fewer workers will be needed as a result of automation. So let everybody go to work and let them also have more time with their families and more time for, to live their lives other than going back and forth to a workplace and working very hard. So this is the time, we say, for that kind of a policy. We also know that, going back to the issue of the environment, that we need to be looking at retrofitting, green retrofits, and the Green New Deal, some of the policies that are there that would put a lot of Canadians to work, including in Alberta, but across the country. We want to see action to address the housing crisis. That is to say, the crisis of affordable housing and the fact that it's so inaccessible virtually everywhere in Canada. Of course, it's much worse in the big cities, but everywhere, the question of affordable housing, meaning housing that doesn't cost you more than 20% of your take-home pay, it's pretty hard to find that kind of housing anywhere in Canada. So we think that this is the right time for the government to get back into the housing business, the same as it did after World War II, and build affordable housing for sale and for rent. We think 1 million units across the country is the way to go. That would create jobs for a lot of people, and it would provide affordable housing for a lot of people. It would also put pressure on the private market when private landlords and realtors, et cetera, have to compete with the publicly owned housing sector. They would be forced to drop their prices and their rents as well. And we also think, by the way, there should be real rent controls so that landlords can't just arbitrarily jack up rents or evict people so that they can raise rents for the next tenant. We also want to see the expansion of the public sector. So we want to see a national childcare program, so long overdue. It should be a public system, and it should be free and universally accessible to families with children across the country. We now live in the 21st century. Women in this country work, and they and their children have the right to safe and secure childcare while their parents are working. And that means that the Canadian government needs to step in with the national childcare program. We also want to see the expansion of healthcare services, and that's really been underlined, and the need for that, the necessity for that through this pandemic. And of course, one of the things that really stands out is the crisis in long-term care and how many people died as a result of the fact that long-term care, so care for the elderly, has been primarily in the realm of the private for-profit, big box US long-term care providers. And as we all know, when you're in that kind of care, it means they're going to give you the least for the most. So the costs of long-term care are very high in the private sector, but the standards of care are very low, and so are and so is the quality of food and the quality of housing, etc. Many of the long-term care facilities where there have been, large infections, large numbers of infections and deaths, have been found to also have had several too many, I don't know if convictions is the right word, but citations by public health for things like bed bugs, for poor quality of health care, poor standards of care for residents, etc. And so it's no surprise actually now that that these have been places of serious infections and deaths as well. So the solution is to put the long-term care under the Medicare Act. This is a proposal, by the way, of the Romano Commission, which some of you may remember way back, I think almost 25 years ago. It proposed that Medicare should be expanded to include dental care, vision care, long-term care. And now we can see why that was a good idea and why many people might have survived the COVID crisis if long-term care had been under Medicare and that there had been standards of care adequate to the situation. So these are some of the things we want to expand. We also want to expand, we can say, post-secondary education. We think that it is unfair and undemocratic to make entrance into a post-secondary institution conditional on your family's income, paychecks, savings accounts. We think if young people and not so young people, anybody who's a student wants to go to a post-secondary institution, if you have the marks, you should be able to go. And if we operated on that basis in Canada, we would have a lot more post-secondary institutions and a lot more staff and faculty, and it would be a place of growing employment and so forth. Beyond that, we want to see the expansion of, in a sustainable way, of industry and manufacturing across the country. As I said earlier, this pandemic has exposed all of the shortcomings of Canada being relegated to producers of raw materials and consumers of finished products as a result of free trade deals that have taken manufacturing, stripped manufacturing out of Canada. We want to see again an appliance industry in Canada. It created a lot of jobs, and you could buy your washing machine and your refrigerator made in Canada. Now you can't because we don't have a domestic appliance industry. We should have one. In the case of Alberta, why not have an agricultural implements industry? As Naomi said earlier, Alberta is a place where there's, and all of the prairies and Ontario and Quebec are places where food production is a big part of the economy. Why would we want to import agricultural implements when we can make them here in Canada? And we used to make them in Brantford. So why not relocate and produce our own agricultural implements industry again? What about a machine tool industry? What about shipbuilding industry? All of these things that would be logical and natural to develop in Canada. So these are things that need to be developed to provide good jobs for Canadian residents and to be able to ensure that creaky stairs, old house, and to be able to ensure that we are not dependent on countries that are off the continent or south of the border to produce materials that we need, or equipment that we need, or to produce good jobs that we need here in Canada. So this needs to be a well thought out, sustainable manufacturing and industrial strategy. And we think that a government that is interested in developing that kind of a policy will be able to do so. We're not sure that the current government is interested in the kind of economic development and social development that I've outlined here. And that's why we think it's pretty important to have communists who are in Parliament and who are able to press for these kinds of demands, things that are important to Canadians that people want, and that so far we haven't had a government in Canada that's been willing to deliver. So we know that in the case of important things like Medicare, for example, or employment insurance or other universal social programs, important advances for working people in Canada. It's never been given by any government anyways. It's always had to be fought for by working people, by the labor movement, and by labor's allies, community allies, the women's movement, the youth movement, Indigenous peoples, and probably that will be no different today than it has been in the past. But we are now at a point where these things are very important. We're facing massive unemployment, and after all of the expenditures that have been made on to provide people with basic incomes and the ability to pay the rent and buy groceries for a short period through the CERB, for example, that the federal government has laid out, the Canada Wage Subsidy, Emergency Wage Subsidy, the rent that has 75% of the rent that will be paid by the federal taxpayers. That's you and me, by the way, for corporate businesses, employment insurance, so on. There's going to be a big bill to pay at the end of this, and you can count on the fact that it won't be the oil and gas industry which are going to pay for these important supports to working people. What we are going to be looking at is austerity in a big way, and big downward pressure on wages and employment, and on social programs. We're going to be looking at restraints, belt tightening, and takebacks. So unless Canadians want to go back to the days of the 1990s or to the days of the 1930s, and some of those things are being talked about now, certainly by the Conservative Party, who talks about Canadians not as victims of the pandemic and of the economic crisis, but as thieves and fraudsters, etc. So you have some idea of what's coming here. So this is the time, we think, for the labor and the people's movements to come together around a set of policies along the lines, I think, that I've just spoken about, plus I'm sure there are many other things that would put Canada on the road to a better future for working people, would reduce the power of the big corporations. We think some of these corporations have to be nationalized, starting with the oil and gas industry, for example. They didn't put the oil in the ground. They didn't put the minerals in the ground. That's nature that did that. And those minerals and oil and gas and so forth belong to the people of Canada, not to Imperial Oil or Exxon. And it's time that these resources were nationalized and put to good use in the interest of Canada and Canadians. And in the case of the oil industry, left in the ground, which is where they ought to stay. But otherwise, we think that that this is a policy that many people would see the use of, the importance of, and that this is something we should be able to join together with others to fight for. Certainly the question of long-term care, for example, putting it under Medicare, expanding Medicare to include dental and vision care. We think a national childcare program is urgent. We think raising the minimum wage is urgent. We think that raising the Canada pension plan is urgent, that expanding employment insurance to cover the jobless in this country for the full duration of unemployment and at 90% of previous earnings. That's the way to put a floor under under people while they find their feet. So I'll stop there. And those are some ideas that you won't hear from the Conservatives or the Liberals. We think they're good ideas, and I hope you do too. So look forward to your questions and your comments and the discussion. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much, Liz. So we already have a bunch of questions set up here. So what I'll do, I think, because there's quite a few of them, I'll maybe read them out, put them in the chats in groups of 3, and then you and Naomi can decide who's going to talk about what, whatever. They're generally around the similar areas. So the first one from Loli: what is your plan for replacing the jobs lost from the closure of these sites? Which I'd assume would be the oil sands. That's what the question came around there. The second one from Jeremy is: the drastic drop in jobs in 2014, 2015 to the present date, and the steady increase in oil production, the data is sometimes attributed to NDP policy. Obviously, this is too narrow. What else contributed? So the loss of jobs. I'll put these in the chat too as well, so you can take a look. And then another one, a very, very pertinent question from a user named Indigenous One. I know the oil industry has affected First Nations in Alberta and BC negatively. Do you think treaty issues will be handled more positively in the future efforts or continue to decline? So 3 really sharp, good questions. If you want to take a pass at those, and there's a bunch more too. So.
Okay, let me jump in. So yeah, so the first question was about replacing the jobs of, I assume that we're talking about the oil and gas sector jobs. Yeah, well, the unions in that sector have been talking about the idea of just transition for a long time, and we fully support that there is going to be change, and the change is going to be difficult, but there's no reason that the change should also be catastrophic in terms of income for the workers. We fully support like a guarantee of jobs for all the people who are in that sector. And there are, frankly, a long list of things which it's really important to be done, where the kind of work that people have done in the past, the sort of construction work and the technical jobs where they're already experienced workers, that I think there's many jobs that are crying out to be done that people with some previous experience in the oil and gas sector would be particularly experienced and suitable with minimal amount of retraining. There's the whole issue of retrofitting of the existing buildings, of restructuring the whole of the energy grid to go over to renewables. These are really, really massive construction projects, as a matter of fact, to essentially rebuild our whole energy grid and essentially recover all the buildings, restructure a lot of the existing stock of buildings, let alone the building of the 1 million new units of housing that Liz mentioned. So, and of course, there's the problem of cleaning up the contamination and the pollution from existing sites at the orphan wells, the tailing ponds at the tar sands. There are actually an enormous number of jobs that really are crying out to be done. And if anything, we're going to have to draw more people than currently work in the energy sector into this really big construction project, to not just to restructure, but to clean up. Now, these things are not going to be done by the oil and gas corporations out of the goodness of their hearts. They've been very good at taking the profits without paying the full cost. And that's why we have this, this pending crisis of orphan wells and so on, of needing to, will require significant leadership and initiative from the state, from the government, from the working people to do these things which are necessary and to do them. Then, okay, The second one about the fluctuations that occurred during the period of the NDP government, or just after when the NDP came to power, just at the point of decline in oil and gas prices. Well, I'll reiterate that I really do think that Alberta and Canada as a whole are bit players in the global marketplace in terms of the influence on supply or the influence on demand, and therefore the influence on the price of the product, the oil and gas. Just before the pandemic hit, you remember that the big story was the catastrophic fall in the price of oil and gas, and this was not because of a sudden loss of demand. There was decline because there was already an economic recession was already starting to develop. But the really big thing was maneuvers by Russia and Saudi Arabia to manipulate the price of oil and gas by manipulating their own supply. This is partly something of a price war, trade war between them, but it was also a maneuver to try to push American fracking out of the world market by pushing the price of the product below the cost of production by fracking in the United States. So it was a kind of geopolitical maneuver, and it's quite clear that Alberta really does not even enter into their calculations for this sort of thing. It's such a minor player. I'm not an expert on this, but I rather think that Saudi Arabia itself has more reserves of energy that's the cheapest and relatively cleanest in the world to supply the rest of the energy source that we can afford to burn for the remainder of human history. We know we have to stop burning stuff. We have to stop putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. We have to draw down the greenhouse gases. So there's a real physical limit on how much oil and gas we're going to be allowed that's compatible with continued human existence. Saudi Arabia could supply all of that at the lowest price, and if they choose to do so, they can push the price down to the level where they're the only ones who can supply it. So there's no point in it. This is not something that we can lay the blame on conservative governments in Alberta either. The only thing we can blame them for is pretending that they did have that kind of control, or pretending that they could plan for a future of high prices for the product. In fact, it's out of our hands. Okay. Then finally, on the question of the Indigenous people, this is a very important question. This would already be a very important question if there were no recession. It would be an important question if there were no global warming. That the legacy of colonialism and the ongoing marginalization of Indigenous people's claims and the failure to accept the rights of Indigenous people in this country simply has to be addressed. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, Canada as a whole, and Alberta in particular, have a long way to go to even begin to address their obligations under this, what's essentially a new regime of international law. And the Indigenous peoples, various different communities, there's many different kinds of communities. They have different sets of resources and different histories, and they're entitled to have different policies. But the one thing is that they are, in fact, all entitled to be the policy, to determine their policies within their own territories. And this is, from the point of view of the working class, this is a good thing. This is not that Canada has to give up something. This is that Canada, by being held accountable for the rights of Indigenous people, that the working class of Canada has here a potential powerful ally in the fight for reasonable economic policies and in the fight for a healthy and livable environment. how it's actually going to work out, that fight, that struggle for Indigenous rights, I don't know. But that it's certainly something where all Canadians have to sign on to this struggle, and the union movement and all the mass movements, all the democratic and progressive movements have to sign on to supporting this particular struggle and working to be allies to this particular struggle. Okay, so over to you, Liz, or next question.
No, I think you covered it there, Naomi. Let's have some more questions.
Okay, we've got a whole bunch, so I'll get them up here. So I'm just gonna pair a couple of these because they are about oil and gas, and we've been talking about that for a bit, and then we'll move on to other ones, which will be sort of outside of that. So Alex McDonald asks, are there any noteworthy contradictions between Canadian and foreign corporations in the energy and gas section? So put that question there. A second question is, if fossil fuels are obsolete, then why are wind turbines built and maintained by diesel-powered vehicles? So I guess that gets into the use of fossil fuels for the production of green technology. There's some questions about industrial production in there. And then I'll add another one here, another third one. This is outside of oil and gas. How would it be, is from Jeremy, how would it be proposed to enforce rent controls, create a minimum amount of affordable housing units per capita across Canada, and ensure most vulnerable populations have access to these first? So maybe that's a question about jurisdiction, federal, is there a role for the Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation, etc. So there's three big questions right there.
Okay, so I'll jump in again on the oil and gas ones. Right? So, are there any noteworthy contradictions between Canadian and foreign corporations in the energy and gas section? I'd have to say, like, my take on this is that fundamentally no. Marx and Engels had spoken about how the working class has no country. Well, really, I think you can say that the multinational corporation has no country. They have no commitment to any particular nationality. And most of these corporations that operate in Canada, in fact, are largely foreign owned. The Canadian ownership within the oil and gas sector has in fact declined, because at one point we had Petro-Canada was a public corporation which made Canada one of the players in our own energy sector, and it was privatized. So now there are a lot of companies in the oil and gas sector, small companies that operate, you might say, on the margins of the industry, and there's a certain amount of contradiction between the really big corporations and those smaller ones. In the same way that there's a struggle and a tension between the Walmarts and the mom and pop retail stores. But essentially, these corporations are all functioning in the same way. They are all motivated in the same way, and they all carry out the same kinds of policies in terms of their, anti-union policies, disregard for environmental requirements, willingness to manipulate administratively to move money and between jurisdictions to lower their taxes, and their willingness to essentially to go anywhere where they're going to make a profit. So I don't think there's really important differences between Canadian and foreign corporations. Even to talk about Canadian and foreign corporations in some ways is meaningless, because all the really big corporations in the world are multinational, have ownership from different countries and operate in different countries simultaneously. Okay, then Gabriel's questions about, if fossil fuels are obsolete, then why are turbines built and maintained by diesel-powered vehicles? Well, because we haven't yet developed and built and sold the vehicles that would run on different power source. It's not that we don't know how. You know, the electric cars and trucks have been in development for quite some time, and we've reached the stage now where there's almost a tipping point where the development, the experimental stage is over, when they're going into production at a scale where they will soon become cheaper than the old-fashioned internal combustion engines. So, but again, that's partly because of policy. Right? Like in many jurisdictions that are not oil and gas producers, they've put much more official government support into the development of electric vehicles, and you know, some of the major industrial players in the world, in Europe, China, and so on, are making a big push now towards electric cars, electric buses, electric trucks. So it doesn't make the fuels less obsolete. The fact that there's been artificially created delays in the implementation of new technology doesn't mean that new technology isn't coming. And that new technology can be implemented a lot faster than, for example, pipelines could be built. So that, you know, it's another argument against the pipelines. It would take so long to build the pipelines. By the time they're done, there's going to be a lot fewer internal combustion engines in the world. So I think for the next question, I'll let Liz take that one on about housing.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Well, I think the main issue about housing, affordable housing, and rent controls and so on is political will. Canada is one of the only countries amongst the OECD countries, so the advanced capitalist countries, that doesn't have a national housing policy, and that's what's missing. And the reason they don't is because they are, what are we going to say, in the pockets of the big landlords and real estate developers and so forth. And you will see that the Liberal and Conservative parties all get big donations from principals and employees of these big corporations. So they want to keep getting those donations and that support, and in exchange they don't interfere in the housing business. They've been out of the housing business as governments since the end of the Second World War. And as a result of that, housing has been almost exclusively in the hands of private developers and landlords. The public housing that was built in the 1960s is being phased out, and you will see that in a big city like Toronto, where we have large public housing left over from that period, that they're currently in the process of tearing it down and replacing it. You know, 3-story walk-ups with yards and gardens and so on. They're replacing them with private condominiums, and we know from what is happening here in Toronto and in other big cities across the continent where this is happening, that this housing is not going to be new housing for the current residents of that area. Those people, who are mainly poor people, are being moved to the very outskirts of the cities, where there is fewer transit, less services, and where it's a lot harder for people to get around than it is in the downtown areas. So the political will that's missing, that's the reason why it's missing. And so what's required? Well, a parliament that's willing to get Canada back into the housing business. This is where an agency like the Canada Mortgage and Housing comes in, CMHC, or there are also municipal housing authorities, provincial ones as well in some cases. And there needs to be a political decision that it's important for these agencies to be funded and to start building housing. We've picked a figure of 1 million units of affordable social housing. We think they should be available for rent, but also for sale at affordable prices. And the affordable prices that have been set by housing experts are that nobody should be paying more than 20% of their take-home pay for shelter costs. And so this would certainly reduce the cost of shelter for all Canadians, because, as I said earlier, the private sector would have to compete with the public sector if there was sufficient housing stock. And a million units would certainly put a lot of pressure on the private landlords, etc. Likewise, the issue of rent controls. Well, rent control legislation is provincial. So what you need is a provincial government that's willing to introduce real rent controls. We think rent should be rolled back so that nobody pays more than 20% of their take-home pay on shelter. And kept there, and that increases in rent should not be simply for the purpose of increasing profits for private landlords. Housing, we think, is a right. People have a right to secure, safe, affordable shelter. You can't. We don't have palm trees here. You have to live indoors in the winter and also in the summer because of the heat these days. And so this is a right. That's the way we see it. And we think housing should be a public utility, and that's the how you would do it. How you would enforce it, you'd use the legislation to enforce it. And if you had sufficient housing stock, you could force the private sector to also lower its costs, and that would be desirable. So in all of these cases, the issue is, can you get a majority in provincial parliaments and in the Parliament of Canada who think that housing is important enough that they're prepared to fight for those kinds of policies? And I would say the way things are now, there are probably people in parliaments who would be willing to fight for those kinds of things, but there isn't a party there that's willing to make that a main issue. And so I think what we're going to have to do to get that is to build a kind of coalitions of people who are supportive of these kinds of demands that will go out and fight for them. The way that we fought for affordable social housing in the post-World War II period, and for Medicare in the 1960s, for employment insurance in the 1930s, and so forth. They don't give you anything. You got to fight for everything, but this one would certainly be worth fighting for. Very important.
Great, thank you very much. So we have more questions too. Okay, so another one, a second one from the user Indigenous one. Locally owned forest companies in British Columbia have been pushed out of business in favor of corporate international ones who leave nothing in either BC or Canada. How do we deal with that? The second question. In Alberta, post-secondary and public school system has been hit hardest in the initial budget onto this, as it is often right now overshadowed by the health crisis.
Okay, shall I take a crack at the first one, Naomi? Do you want to, or which one do you want to speak to?
You go ahead.
Okay, well, I think the big issue here is corporations have way too much power in this country, and the big issue is how to put curbs on corporate power. And so again, you need a majority in parliaments in order to say, no, you can't do this. You're not willing to do this. And I think we don't have that at the moment. We can certainly see that around the whole issue of Indigenous rights. And as Naomi mentioned earlier, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which gives Indigenous peoples the right to say, no, you cannot to proceed with these kinds of developments on our lands. We do not agree to them. Likewise, the rights of peoples in not Indigenous peoples, but people who live in other communities who are going to suffer if jobs are lost in this or that sector. because the employers decide that they can make more money by going somewhere else, or they can eat up a smaller company because they have more capital, more connections, more ability to well, what am I going to say? To eat up another company, to put them out of business. So you need laws at the federal level and the provincial level that would prevent corporations from making those kinds of decisions that are strictly to do with the bottom line, with the profits of this or that corporation. Corporations should be required to operate within the boundaries of the interests of Canada and the interests of the Canadian people. And this is a very novel idea. I realize in Canada, with the kinds of governments that we have now, which are mainly there to serve corporations. But we think really the best thing would be in the case of natural resources. I mentioned earlier that we want to see energy and natural resources, nationalized and put under public ownership and democratic control. And that would certainly be the case with forestry companies. I remember not so many years ago, the big battles over old growth timber, and some of the people who worked in that sector, who saw no other opportunity to work anywhere else, simply said, we have to cut down those timbers, otherwise we can't feed our kids. But of course, if you had a government that was, whose interest was in, maintaining the environment and in ensuring that the last, that every tree was cut down to the very last one, like the fish, by the way, in the East Coast that have been fished out by the same logic of corporate harvesting. You just take out everyone till there's none left, and then you moved on somewhere else. So this is not the interests of the people who work or live in those areas, and certainly not in the interest of the country. So you need laws that will put the interests of the environment and of the people before the interests of these big and sometimes not so big corporations, private for-profit corporations. So there's a battle to be had there, but they're important battles. There was recently struggles underway, by the way, over what you call them, not refineries, sawmills, and the use of mercury and other metals that were poisoning Indigenous peoples. And, we had this display of some workers saying, well, they had to, this was their livelihood, and somebody else had to look after the interests of Indigenous peoples. They had to look after their kids. This is a catastrophic approach. The only way to, for people to live healthy lives is for them to work together against these kinds of gross, profit-driven enterprises that take advantage of people and end up taking people's lives. That's certainly the case in the English water river system, for example, where mercury is poisoned the people who live there, the Indigenous people who live there. And the Canadian government has known about that for, I don't know, more than 30 years, 40 years, I think, and done nothing about it. So that company is folded up and gone away now, but the results are still there, and the Indigenous people who live there have suffered greatly and continue to suffer, and so do their children, because of, everything's down to profit. If you can make a buck, then you have the right to do that. Well, that's what's got to change.
Great. Thank you, Naomi. There was the question about post-secondary in the public school system.
Yeah.
And the budget cuts. Would you be able to take that one?
Sure. Yeah. Okay, so yes, it's quite true, right? That other things have kind of pushed it off the front page, but this Kenny regime began with these sort of really serious, savage cuts to education. This really exemplifies that neoliberal austerity approach. Is that anything that's not directly profitable to the biggest corporations is to be sacrificed, and because they're so wedded to this this sort of wild ideology of this sort of voodoo economics of we cannot have deficit, we must lower the taxes for the corporations and at the same time not have a deficit. So it's going to be a big struggle. It's a real fight to try to get the funding restored. And here again, we so need to have the broad, united movement where the teachers and the nurses and the doctors and the environmentalists and the indigenous people and so on are all supporting each other, because the proposal that we put forward, our program, has something that addresses the needs of each one of these movements. None of them will be achieved if each one stays in its own little corral and just talks about its own issues. It's really important for people to see that these problems are interconnected, that we have the same enemy, and that the solution is going to require more militancy and more unity on the part of the working class as a whole and all these different movements. So I think that teachers, the teachers union and the teachers generally, and students and the student unions are all called upon to work together to campaign for restoration of funding and for the right to good quality education, and in a way that doesn't leave post-secondary students like drowning in debt. But also they need to realize that they need the allies as well. They need to also support the general working class movement, the indigenous people, the environmentalists, the health system. That all these demands have to be embraced by all these movements, because it's what we really need is a general broad anti-monopoly coalition, is a phrase that we've used in the past, a really general broad movement that unites all these different movements and all these different interests, something that's strong enough to withstand an election, so that even when an election is called, that that this united group doesn't splinter down into each person going away and supporting their own individual political party, but that this kind of a coalition holds together and holds all the parties in the election accountable and judges them by how well they adhere to, how strongly they commit themselves to the general program of such a coalition. So that in the sort of broadest sense is what should be the strategy for every progressive movement, I think, is to find their allies and support them, to find that general, broader program that they can all get together on.
Could I say just a quick addition to what you said, Naomi? And that's just a little bit of maybe of history. And recently in Ontario, where I live, there was a big fight by the teachers' unions. Here we have the Catholic teachers, the French Catholic teachers, the elementary and the secondary school teachers. So there's four different organizations of teaching staff. And then, of course, there's also CUPE, but CUPE had settled. The other four groups all went out at the same time, and while they were involved in different sets of negotiations with the provincial government, they all had essentially the same demands. And the demand was that the cuts to education that had been brought in the provincial budget by this new Tory government that we have here with Doug Ford did great harm to students and to education, and that they had to be withdrawn. They also asked for a 1% increase in wages and some other small things to do with health and safety and benefits, etc. But they were all negotiating under a wage freeze, by the way, which the government had also brought in right across the public sector. And why do they do that? Because the public sector are their employees and they can do it. And so they often, when they're bringing in austerity measures, they will go after the public sectors, and the teachers and healthcare workers, municipal workers are of course amongst the front lines of people who are in the public sector. So the point here is that because the teachers' union stood together, and because they put the interests of their students and of public education in the right up front, the public was supporting them right from the get-go. And the Tories were in real trouble here, and they were actually saved by COVID, the coronavirus arriving when it did, because they would have had all of their demands would have been rolled back if the teachers had been able to continue with their strike past the early part of the year. So the Tories found themselves from being at first very popular, because they had, kicked out the Liberals after 15 years, and people were mad at the Liberals, but they had no idea what they were going to get until they came in with these massive cuts to healthcare and education. Healthcare too, by the way, which didn't sit very well with people after COVID arrived, and all of the holes in hospital services and in healthcare services, public health, etc., long-term care were all exposed. So thank you, Mr. Ford, for all of that. The other thing, I think similar things are happening in Quebec in the public sector, in British Columbia. And of course, the big story with education is what happened in the United States, where they have right to work laws now in more than half of all US states, which means you can be in one workplace, and a part of the workforce in that one workplace can belong to a union and part cannot. So how can you pull out a workplace on strike when half the people aren't in the union and are still working? So this is, it's union busting is what these right to work laws are. So the teachers' unions have been, they have unions, but they have very, very few rights and hardly any muscle, because of they've been undermined by these right to work laws. But anyway, every year they would go to the state legislature and ask, please, sir, can we have some money? And every year the legislatures, I'm thinking about Virginia, was the first one, they would say, no, you can't. And then they go back to work, and then they come back the next year and go through the whole thing again. And they got to the point a couple of years ago where they just said, that's enough. We're just not going to accept it. And they went out on strike, and they went and occupied the state legislature, and the students came out and supported them, and their parents came out, and the whole community came out, and they forced the state legislature to give them some money, because they weren't just facing the teachers' union, they were facing the whole community, the kids and the parents and the public and the workers in the education system. And this was so successful that workers in other U.S. states around Virginia in the education system did the same things. And suddenly you see this social solidarity roll out, and people understand if they stick together and they put together their common interests and they fight together, they can win. And I guess the other example, the really inspirational one in terms of Canada, is what the students did in Quebec in 2012, when the provincial government at the time, a Liberal government, tried to raise tuition fees for post-secondary students in Quebec, and the students said, no, we have a right to post-secondary education that we can still afford. Their demand was they wanted free education, but they certainly were not prepared to accept any increases in tuition fees. And what started out as a student protest ended up with virtually, working class people all over the province coming out and marching through the streets of the cities and towns across Quebec, wearing the little red squares. So I just wanted to tell you this because I thought maybe some of you don't know about this, and this is pretty inspiring. This is the way forward. This is the way to go. This is the way we're going to win, and not only in education, but in in all of the sectors, starting with the public sector, but workers in the private sector are also fighting. There's a big struggle going on now in Regina with the co-op refinery workers, and that they've been out for a good part of the winter, that they have the support of their community and of workers across the country. And this is a big fight, but I think they're going to win too. So solidarity, unity, this is the way forward.
Great, thank you. So we still have some more questions. Throw some two in here. The first one from Vinny. It says, pretty vague, but I'm interested to know the status of the agricultural sector in Alberta. Naomi mentioned that it was larger before the advent of oil and gas. Are there any prospects for renewal there? That's one question. And then another question, new deals.
Okay, so agriculture. All right, first of all, I don't claim to be a real expert on this, but I would tell you that the Communist Party is the party in Alberta that has a long history of paying attention to the problem of agriculture and to the problem of the family farm. So now the agriculture didn't go away, of course, when oil and gas was starting to be developed. I mean, the agriculture has continued, but what has happened is it has also been corporatized, like over a really long period of time. I mean, really, in the whole history of agriculture in Alberta, since initial settlement of one family on each quarter section, there's this long trend of consolidation of new technologies where larger and larger areas of land could be farmed by a smaller and smaller number with the use of machinery, and essentially the depopulation of the countryside. So we now have, our agricultural industry is still important. I mean, it still produces a lot of food. It's done with an astonishingly small number of people actually being directly involved in agricultural production because they are so productive with such a high level of technology. But some of this actually is, it's got to the point of going too far. I mean, there's a problem of the use of chemicals in agricultural production, which has now reached the point of diminishing returns, where we have to start looking at decontaminating agricultural lands as well as oil and gas sites, because it's part of a general global problem, right? Like overuse of pesticides has really disrupted the whole balance of nature, right? Like the disappearance of insects, disappearance of birds, threats to wildlife, to the whole ecology. There's also, I think, there's a more important, a more serious threat to human well-being in the over concentration of agriculture and over reliance on a kind of corporate model of decreased genetic diversity, like a smaller and smaller number of varieties of staple plants being grown, which makes monoculture, just makes them more susceptible to new pests and new diseases. It's sort of like the same situation in the plant world, in the agricultural world, that has happened in the virus. Something will come along, like the potato blight that killed millions, where millions starved in Europe, especially in Ireland, because of over-reliance on one single variety of staple food, of potatoes. Well, we're in some ways in that same situation now, that our agriculture is too reliant on a relatively small, a narrow genetic base, and our whole food supply of the country in general, I think, is reliant on a global system. Like foods are transported around the world. We eat fruits and vegetables from South Africa and from South America and so on. Now, it's great that we have these possibilities, but it's also a vulnerability. So I think an agricultural policy, a stable, sustainable agriculture has to look at decreasing this reliance on a narrow genetic base, increase diversity genetically, and increased plans, I think, for more regional self-sufficiency in food. Not necessarily on the scale of just, say, the province of Alberta, but generally in the world, I think we need at least a kind of a plan B, like, as in this special case with the pandemic, of providing more regional self-sufficiency in food so that we're less susceptible, less vulnerable to shocks to the global system. And of course, on a global scale, just the problem of food insecurity, of actual hunger, actual famines, because of the agricultural systems being distorted by global trade deals and by corporate sort of invasion of what was previously sort of indigenous self-sufficient kind of farming. So some things have to change in agriculture. I don't actually know what they are, but I know that we have researchers, and that we can rely on a certain amount of research and development if we have the political will to put into sustaining smaller scale agriculture, which would in fact employ more people than the corporate model we have now, and with some commitment to a more sustainable environmental stewardship in our agriculture. And one other thing we didn't mention before, but that there's room, I think, in the Alberta economy for more processing of agricultural products, like less export of unprocessed raw materials. It's not a really huge part of the economy, like the whole rebuilding of the whole energy grid would be, but it would be part of it. It would be one aspect of a general restructuring of our economy with more production locally. So I think I'll pass it back over to Liz then to talk about the Green New Deal.
Yeah, thank you. Just one addition on the two very interesting comments that you made, Naomi, and that is the question of Canadian sovereignty and food sovereignty also fits in here. And I think the free trade deal, the USMCA deal, or NAFTA too, as it's known, is going to have a really negative impact on Canadian agriculture, on food sovereignty, on the quality of food that Canadians can eat, and also on farm incomes and farmers and farm workers. And I'm thinking in particular of, we have the free trade deal that sorry. Okay, to start my video here. Okay, I got carried away with myself there. How's that? Better. Okay. So the NAFTA 2 agreement here is disrupting the food production in Canada. We're now going to be importing the milk from the United States that will have the hormones in it that enable farmers in the U.S., dairy farmers in the U.S., to make their cows produce much larger quantities of milk than they would without the hormone. The problem is that the hormone stays in the cow and it stays in the milk, and then the milk is exported to Canada because we've opened up our access from the United States. Now they can export milk and pork and eggs into Canada. And so we're going to be drinking that milk. Our kids are going to be drinking that milk. Other parts of the food supply chain are also going to be affected. The wheat, for example, will be imported from the U.S. into Canada. Canada has a very high reputation for high quality, very good reputation for high quality grains. So when Canada says this is a quality grain, I don't know what the actual qualifiers are, but if it's this high level of grain, people who are buying it from Canada know that that's what it is. But now with this agreement, we're going to get US wheat of a lower quality, which is going to be mixed in with Canadian wheat, and that's what's going to be exported. So the quality will be impacted. People who are buying wheat from Canada will know that they can no longer count on the quality being what it's what it's put out to be. So these are not good things, and that it's reminiscent of what has happened in Europe with with the European Union and the division of labor, where this country will produce this food and this one will produce that, and that one will produce no food at all. It'll do something else. And this is a corporate model. It's bad for food quality, and it's certainly bad for food sovereignty in the countries concerned. On the second question with respect to the Green New Deal, well, it depends which Green New Deal you're looking at, because there are quite a few different models that are circulating. But we think in general that these are good ideas. They correspond with most of the policies that we have with respect to what's the energy base that we think has to be built in Canada, and what's the one that has to be shelved. So we think the key thing that we have to offer that nobody else is offering at this stage, and we'd like people to jump on this bandwagon, is public ownership of energy and natural resources across the country. That's really the key thing, because we can see that, for example, the development of renewable energy in the Green Party's policies, their view is not that this should all be under public ownership, but they see this as the possibilities for the development of new businesses, private businesses, an opportunity for somebody to make some money developing thermal energy or solar energy or whatever the case may be. Certainly in the case of solar energy, there are a lot of little companies around that'll put solar panels on your house or build windmills or whatever the case may be. But we're not very interested in building up new businesses in the energy sector. What we want to build up is an energy grid across the country, which is publicly owned, and which is in business and producing energy that is environmentally safe and secure, for the future and available to all Canadians at a low price. So in the past, we can say that the hydro generators across the country, which were provincial, and in the case certainly of Ontario and Quebec, they were provincially owned. Ontario Hydro is over 100 years as a publicly owned corporation providing cheap energy and reliable energy to businesses and to homeowners, for a long period of time. And then it got privatized by the Liberals, or a good portion of it did. So we want to build up a renewable energy sector that would also fit in with hydro. Hydro is part of a renewable energy plan that could produce a cheap energy to homeowners and also to industry and business that would be beneficial to the Canadian economy. And developing a whole bunch of private, corporate interests developing this aspect or that aspect doesn't fit with that vision. We think that this public ownership is really central to where we want to go. And we also want to, we think it's very important, the point that Naomi made earlier, to guarantee the jobs of people who are currently in the in the old industries, oil and gas, that they also have to feed their families, and the government should have the responsibility to guarantee their employment at the same wages, whether it's in the renewable energy sector or whether it's in some other sector, the public sector, or in a new manufacturing sector. But people have a right to a job, a good job at equivalent wages, if not better, and not to be victims of a change in the way that energy is developed and produced in Canada. So those are some of the key things that we see. The opportunities for creating jobs with renewable energy and a whole new approach to energy, one that's based on public ownership, are really great. They're significant. This will be an important development for Canada. So, and we know that there are others who are involved in things like the Green New Deal, where we have a lot in common, and we certainly see ourselves cooperating with many of those peoples to achieve the same results, provided that they have to do with public ownership.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a bunch of discussion that's happening in the chat here, but not really any questions. I did want to acknowledge it because it's really interesting what people are saying. Maybe I can, I'll put out one last call for questions, and if maybe somebody wants to talk about somebody who's seeing this, if they want to get involved with the party or learn more or anything like that, what they could do, would anybody be up for taking that while I try to fish out some more questions here?
Yes, certainly. We're glad to hear from people. We would like to continue this discussion. I'm stuck here in my Zoom corner. I'm not seeing the discussion that's going on the YouTube chat, but I'd be interested to take a look at that. So if you do wish to get a hold of us, you can find us through, the Communist Party of Canada website. You can find us through the Communist Party Alberta Facebook page. And you could also just email us at communistparty-alberta@shaw.ca. And on the party website, there is contact information for you to actually send messages, or if you wanted to click the button, being more interested in the party or in joining the party. We're happy to follow up and respond to those discussions. I'd also like to, actually, Liz, why don't you talk a little bit about people's voice and
Oh,
We're
sure.
currently having the campaign to support our party paper.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for suggesting that. So, for those of you who are just getting to know us, People's Voice is a twice monthly publication of a socialist, communist news and analysis of the struggle for socialism and the struggle for workers' rights in Canada and around the world. There's a lot of information there that you won't see anywhere else. So it's a valuable tool, especially today in the in the context of fake news and the stuff that you read on social media that makes you say, really, really, or the stuff you hear coming out of the White House or from other very right-wing politicians, far-right politicians around the world. So accurate information is pretty important. So, of course, our newspaper doesn't receive any support from any big corporations or from the Canadian government. It is solely supported by its readers. And every spring the paper is in a fund drive that goes now until June 30th. It's been extended a little bit because of the pandemic. It's made it difficult for some of the fundraising events that used to take place. So we are trying to raise $50,000, which we do every year, and we hope to do this year. We're $18,000 short, and this is money which we collect from bake sales and garage sales, and we have a walkathon every year in British Columbia, and there are clubs that have house parties, and people do what they can to fundraise for the paper. And of course, there are many people who just make a donation to contribute to keep the paper going. So if anyone here would like to make a contribution to People's Voice, you could do that by writing a check, make it out to People's Voice, and send it to the paper's office in Vancouver, and the address is 706 Clark Drive, Vancouver. What is it? V5L3J1, I think. And there's also, if you go to the People's Voice website, there is a PayPal button there. And if you don't like writing checks and using the mails, you can always make a contribution through PayPal on the People's Voice website. So I don't know what else I can say, except that there are not many newspapers, labor newspapers anymore that are publishing, and a lot of progressive organizations that in the past had publications that were regular can't afford it anymore because of the cost of printing and especially the cost of postage. So this is I'm sad to say, almost a unique newspaper that comes out regularly. It's a working class newspaper, a fighting newspaper. It sees itself as having a function of informing people about what's going on in the world and in the country, but also of educating them and keeping them on top of struggles that are taking place across the country, so that working people here can support working people there, and altogether we can make a better world. And if you don't have a subscription, by the way, to People's Voice, you can get one for $30, also using the PayPal application, or you can, if you're a low income, you can get a subscription for $20. You just indicate when you're filling out the subscription form which category you fall into. So thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think that is about it for the questions that we have. There's lots of good discussion as well. I don't have have much to add except to thank you very much to Naomi and Liz both, and to anybody else who joined us in the chat room and sent questions. If you take the chance to follow so subscribe to the channel itself, you'll get a notification when we have something else. So yeah, that's about it. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Jay.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.